Hello, Blogging Heads Nation, and welcome to the Heather versus Eli, Eli versus Heather, neoliberal versus neocon show, end of the year edition. For those of you who don't know us, I'm Heather Hurlburt, Executive Director of the National Security Network in Washington. And Eli, how are you styling yourself these days?
Well, I think we can say it now. I am the new national security correspondent for the Washington Times.
Wow.
And a contributing editor at the New Republic.
Congratulations. When did the Washington Times thing become official?
Well, I wrote my first piece about a week ago, or 10 days ago. And I started officially full-time on January 1st.
Now, indulge us with a quick diversion into, in the current parlous state of journalism, what's the state of the Times, given that a large portion of its base is packing its bags and leaving town in the next 6 weeks?
Well, actually, it's a good time when you have a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress to be part of a conservative newspaper. With the demise of my newspaper, the old newspaper, the New York Sun, it's the last, kind of any national newspaper, and essentially the Washington Times is expanding is I think the only newspaper that's expanding at least on a national level. And this is coming when we're seeing massive cuts at the major news magazines, as well as I think we're going to see rounds of cuts at the Washington Post, and New York Times had to leverage they had to increase debt based on how much they owned in the building that they are headquartered in Times Square. So it is it's a tough time for the industry.
Well, I guess if somebody has to, the Washington Times has to prosper. I'm glad it's prospering you, so that we'll be able to continue. Now,
but I think you'd want to. I want a Nation magazine, even though I don't agree with it.
I want a lively and vibrant debate. That is true.
Right.
And I want people doing smart reporting and holding my people accountable. I think that's the other thing.
Right.
I'm not always sure that what the Times does counts as smart reporting and holding people accountable, but with you there...
Well, Barbara Slavin is going to be my editor.
Barbara Slavin is going to be your editor?
Isn't that weird?
It's fantastic for Barbara as for you that she has a good job with benefits somewhere, but...
John Solomon is the new editor-in-chief, and he was the former head of the AP. They're bringing in a lot of people who you would not associate with kind of conservative, kind of conservative journalism. And there's always, I thought the Washington Times front page always had always broke news. Whether you agreed with Bill Gertz or didn't agree with Bill Gertz, he always brought new facts to light.
Well, and I will also say that the foreign affairs coverage, they have made very good use of the wire services and little indigenous reporting outfits that have stuck it out there as the big operations have folded their tents. And they do have a quite reliable and truly global foreign affairs coverage. So I will give them that. And if you are going to be there and Barbara Slavin is going to be there, I will actually take a deep breath and start reading the foreign news section more regularly.
Okay.
I'm not saying I'm going to pay for it, mind you, but
no one pays for any news. That's the story of my industry.
No, I have to say I'm a journalism brat myself. My parents met on the staff of their college newspaper, and so I actually do. I made it a point, as much as I find the Post regrettable in many respects, I made it a point to get a paper subscription to it. Just because that's part of what you do when you live somewhere. You support the print journalism organs. But
I hope so.
But I recognize that I'm terribly old-fashioned in that.
Well, I said this on other blogging heads, but if people like a particular news sort of reporter, or they like a particular journal, and they can get it for free, maybe they could also pay for it the way that they would pay for locally grown produce, or I don't know, they would invest in stocks in their portfolio that didn't benefit from the genocide in Sudan.
Eli, that sounds so touchingly left wing of you. It kind of makes me get a little misty eyed, here at Christmas time and all the rest of it. But I also think that's a very nice way to talk to the upper middle classes about print newspapers. That we need to think of it as like organic produce.
Well, yeah, because I'm just saying that if we don't have a journalist industry, and the problem is also that it's hard to get a job with a salary that's commensurate for someone like myself in his 30s on just doing online stuff. I think that there's very few the salaries have not caught up online. So the jobs that people compete for with kind of grown-up salaries are on print, but obviously the future is going to be online. So,
well, it's tremendously evocative to me that you have somebody like Barbara Slavin, who really is one of the better folks in the business. My dad worked with her for a number of years, which is one of the reasons I'm such a fan. But and you have somebody like that, and then somebody like yourself, who, whatever one thinks of your politics, is an interesting emerging voice on the scene in recent years, and kind of a good example of the combination of what you can do with a savvy understanding of online and some kind of commitment to the ethos of print journalism, and that both of you would be going for print jobs at this particular moment, I think speaks a lot about how the online sector just isn't where we need it to be in terms of fulfilling the functions. And now I get to haul out my old Jefferson quote about if I had to choose a state without newspapers or newspapers without the state, I should choose the latter.
That's a great quote, and I'd like to say I choose the latter, but I don't know. I'm a Hobbesian.
Because you're a right-winger. But anyway, we digress, and
okay.
we tread upon the generosity of our audience. And speaking of reporting and so on, Eli has been having some phone conversations with some folks in the Israeli-Palestinian region, and so we decided today we were going to start off with him talking a little bit about that. And after we...
Well, I'm not going to give you any more of an update than I think you'd get on the wires when this comes out, so I don't want to kind of overplay it. But I did call and have a conversation with the IDF and some friends of mine who are in Israel who know and, are kind of affiliated with what's going on in it. What I was trying to find out, Heather, and this is a great starting point, is sort of what's the strategic mission of all of this?
Which is an excellent question that I kind of look at it from afar and say, well, okay, I understand the level of angst that could lead to this, but what the hell is it supposed to accomplish? Yeah,
so, and I have to tell you that, let me give you, first of all, the IDF. It's a muddled message, which is what, on the one hand, they say, listen, we are attacking the infrastructure that allows for Hamas to resupply, and the term that I got was barrages of rocket fire. Mm-hmm. So they know that they're not going to stop every single rocket fire, but they think they can at least diminish or destroy the ability of Hamas to shoot, flurries of rockets at once that, kind of create a perpetual air raid siren drill in Sderot and even Ashkelon and other places in southern Israel. So that is, and that's why they say, hey, we've gotten, they point to the fact that, yes, over 300 people have been killed, but the vast majority, even by Hamas's count and even by the UN's count, are combatants, which, is, I guess, given the fact that it's such a densely populated area in Gaza, I guess is pretty amazing. It accounts to the precision, though there's still at least 50 or 60 civilian casualties that the Israelis are acknowledging, at least on background. And then, we're going to probably see more. Because this is not the end of the operations. We're talking today on Monday morning on the East Coast. And secondly, then there's this other notion that you get, and a good example of this is Michael Oren and Yossi Klein Halevi have a piece in the Wall Street Journal where they talk about this idea of deterrence and Hamas. And that strikes me that, so they'll internalize a lesson in this. I mean, that strikes me as muddled, because I don't think Hamas is going to respond to impositions to the population of Gaza, because I think ultimately Hamas profits from the misery of Gazans in the way that Saddam in some ways profited from the misery of Iraqis under the sanctions. And so I don't know how deterrence necessarily works in this case. And I'm skeptical, because I don't think it's that complicated to build Qassam rockets that any kind of strategic effect you have on their infrastructure, unless you're committed to constantly bombing them, is going to kind of have a lasting impact. I don't know what you think of all that.
I have one practical question first, which is, so they seem to at least want to give the impression that there's also going to be a ground invasion. When is that going to happen? And again, what on earth is it for?
Well, I'm going to be proven wrong if they do a ground invasion, but I don't know that there is. I mean, they've called up some reserves. They are in the process. The Knesset would have to, or rather the cabinet would have to, agree to a ground invasion. It's not part of the sort of plan at this point. And I guess if there is a ground invasion, If the strategic aim of the ground invasion was to find the leadership of Hamas and deport them or arrest them and then replace them with I don't know who. I mean, does Fatah have the ability to do that at this point? Do they have somebody else in mind? I mean, I don't think that the Israeli government at this point wants to reoccupy Gaza indefinitely.
That's what, again, I find muddled and confusing about this, that
right.
The only objective I can see for it is that it's the prelude to some kind of reoccupation that allows you to go house to house and search for rocket components. What I see as the actual consequences of it so far are, number one, casualties among Israelis actually have gone up since it started.
Well, yeah.
Number two, you have zero, you've gone from sort of slim chances to negative chances of engaging in a peace process any time, of having a Palestinian interlocutor. You've made it harder rather than easier for Fatah to negotiate, never mind whatever it is you've done with Hamas. And you've given yourself a huge black eye in international public opinion by what looks like responding to one death with 300 deaths. So I sort of scratched my head, and I read somewhere in between my fog of mulled wine and latkes over the last 4 or 5 days that there's a thought that somehow this will provoke Hamas to negotiate a new and more favorable ceasefire, which seems to me to be a profound misreading of the way Hamas actually works. And to be a profound misreading of the lessons that ought to have been learned from the last war in Lebanon. And then I think what I find most agonizing is that then I think one has to come around to a set of domestic political considerations. And you have to sort of say, okay, well, who is this going to strengthen and who is this going to hurt? And I must say, one of the people that I think it's going to hurt most dramatically is Barack Obama, through no fault of his own, in as much as there was absolutely nothing he could have done about this. But, it's very hard to see what on earth you do from an American perspective on this going forward, and how you act as any kind of moderating influence. You think about Fatah and you think, what could be offered to Fatah that would get them to negotiate after this? What that would leave them in any kind of tenable position with the Palestinian people? And you can't think of anything. And then you look at just one more thing, Eli, that you also look at the Israelis and you say, okay, after this, after you go through this tremendous barrage, but the rockets keep coming, that really, I think of my husband's cousins, who live on a kibbutz, and what do you say to them in terms of what on earth can make you safe? And it's very hard for me to see this as anything other than just tremendously damaging for everybody. And I keep sort of hoping against hope that maybe there's some angle I haven't considered yet. But I'm just tremendously saddened by it from all. I'm saddened that the Israelis felt it necessary to do it. I'm saddened that they did it the way they did it. I just see nothing good coming out of this.
Well, let me take some of your points in reverse order. On Fatah, there was going to be a political crisis between Hamas and Fatah anyway, and it is, in some ways, it's in Fatah's interest that Hamas is weakened. If this weakens Hamas in the kind of cold calculus of the fact that the Israelis feel that they're getting senior leaders and killing them, or they're destroying, I don't know. They're doing a series of things that would disrupt Hamas's infrastructure and network, which I think is sort of remains to be seen. I was in Israel covering the last war with Hezbollah, and we were getting a lot of the same kind of statements about that.
So Eli, let me stop and ask you, because I think actually that's the key question, is that I think everybody agrees is the goal. How do you weaken Hamas, or at the very least weaken the rationale for its violence and terroristic activities? How do you weaken that in the long run, not just the short run? How do you weaken it in a way that doesn't make it come back stronger and more hardline next time? And it just seems to me that there's not a lot of evidence that this method works in the long run.
Well, I think that's right, but that's why I think in some way there's an irony here, which is that the the left and the international community and certainly the kind of Arab propaganda machines, they accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing and being quite brutal when in fact the strategic logic of Hamas is that there is no plurality for Israel to literally cleanse Gaza or for that matter the West Bank. Which is to say that if Israel was as vicious and brutal as its critics, then there is an argument that maybe Hamas would not do such provocative things. But to a degree, the fact that it was willing to break the ceasefire, that there was a week of diplomacy on the part of the Israelis, trying to get the UN Security Council to condemn Hamas for this, trying to sort of ratchet up pressure. And there was a week in which, there was kind of a shrug from a lot of the people who were so outraged at this point. And we very rarely also hear this. I mean, here's an interesting fact in all this, that while you wouldn't know it if you just listened to people like Daniel Levy or J Street, Meretz, the far-left party in Israel, has supported the operation thus far. Now, they may move away from it. Israeli politics is always really fluid, but at least the initial operation was supported by the Israeli left. And I think we always hear about the Arab street, we never hear about the Jewish street. What is the effect of having kind of the world not really care about Hamas's provocative actions in breaking the ceasefire, but then only entering into it when, does Israel have a right to what they claim to be self-defense? That's a separate order of questions than does this make strategic sense, where I think I'm inclined to agree with you, but I think if Barack Obama wants to solve this conflict, he needs to figure out a way to cleverly, without choosing Palestinian leaders, develop a third alternative between Fatah, which is corrupt, has diverted humanitarian aid, is just largely discredited, and Hamas, which, is, I think, genetically predisposed not to seek a two-state solution, let alone, is responsible for, far the rabbit that encourages 5-year-olds to kill themselves and so forth and so on.
Well, Eli, this is where I get to be more conservative than you, which is always fun. Hold on to your seats, readers. Yeah. Okay. Old-fashioned small C conservative, which is exactly one of the big problems with U.S. intervention, not just here but in other places, is this idea that Barack Obama, or anyone else for that matter, can magically create a movement in Palestinian politics. In the long run, the question is, can there be made space for such a movement to emerge and conditions that make it look like such a movement would have success, that it would be profitable, that it would be more profitable than either violence or corruption or a mix of the two? And, the tragedy of this is that while the short-term Israeli concerns are very real, they make it much harder to go in that direction in the long term for, Barack Obama or Tzipi Livni or King of Jordan or the Saudis or the Iranians or anybody. Nobody can go to a place like Gaza right now and say, hey, what you guys need are some nice centrists that the West likes to talk to, and then this won't happen anymore.
Well, but
I think, the sort of conservative point I want to make is that you actually, and we really should have learned this by now, you can't create moderate forces out of clay, Genesis notwithstanding. They have to emerge, and if you want them to emerge, you have to sort of allow space for them to emerge, and you have to be patient with the somewhat imperfect models that come up out of the mud by themselves. And that's what American what we're so bad at as a society, and that extends from your fellow travelers to my fellow travelers.
Well, but okay, Heather, let me say this though, that there is a Hamas and Arafat's Fatah had an interest in extinguishing, jailing, killing, exiling any alternative or moderate alternative to them. Mm-hmm. And that we have to recognize that listen, I don't blame Dennis Ross and Clinton and Sandy Berger and Madeleine Albright for taking a shot on the Oslo process. At the time, we didn't know Arafat's true intentions. It would have been better had there been more attention paid to all the amount of money he was stealing. But at that point, we needed to sort of let history sort of play out. But since I think Fatah is so discredited, I don't think we can. That is what's on offer right now. What is the policy? And I don't know if Barack Obama is going to continue it or not. But the policy is General Dayton is training up a new round of security people that maybe one day will be able to sort of take control of Gaza and beat back Hamas. And I think that Hamas is probably stronger politically at this point, but in part their strength is not just because they were, when they were out of power, better humanitarians than Fatah, which is true, but it's also because they intimidate and kill their political opposition. So there was, I mean, in the first Intifada, there was an indigenous Palestinian leadership that was largely ignored at the Madrid conference. There were people like Sari Nusseibeh. I'm not saying that this amounts to a movement, but there's always people who, if approached right, are indigenous. It's just they're, usually in hiding when thugs like Hamas are running the place.
Well, the other problem, I mean, and this is a broader problem than just in Palestine, is that the folks who ultimately represent the kind of tendency that you're talking about, folks who have internal interest in building up their own societies that are stronger than their external interest in causing mayhem in other societies, that in the Middle East, those forces tend to come cloaked in fairly religious forms, and we tend not to be. I mean, it's the Muslim Brotherhood dilemma. And so where there have been either clearly extant or the nascent and the possibility to allow to develop forces that have rhetoric that we don't like, that have practices that certainly I would grieve deeply to have to live under.
Yeah, as a feminist.
Well, just as a woman, never mind the feminist part. I mean,
right, and I speak in solidarity with women in that.
Let's just say there are lots of societies that I wouldn't like to live in, and Sarah Palin wouldn't like to live in either. But that and exactly for reasons like that, we aren't able to bring ourselves to do business with them, and we aren't able to bring ourselves to give them the space, which sometimes, mind you, implies not doing business with them and not embracing them publicly and not trying to make it look like they're our creatures. And as I said, we're just terribly bad at that, in part because we don't understand the societies well enough, and this is a great segue to the Huntington part of the conversation we were going to have, in part because ultimately we're not really comfortable in promoting civilizational norms that are very different from our own, but in the long run, those are the ways that some of these places can be peaceful. And if you look at societies that have adopted many of the norms and values of Western civilization, or have sort of indigenized and made them their own, or found them within their own cultures, maybe is a good way of putting it, those are places that have had the leisure to do it in a certain amount of peace. And so if you want Palestine to be a place where, I can go in my above-the-knee skirts, or Sarah Palin can go in her couture clothes, or whatever you want it to be, or, more importantly, Palestinian women have rights, then you have to let it happen their way. And that, is the lesson of... it's a lesson that's been learned and unlearned again and again and again, and the last 8 years are one more example. And it's actually, I think, a lesson that Samuel Huntington would have agreed with. I put up on Democracy Arsenal the final paragraph from the original Clash of Civilizations article in Foreign Affairs, and it's very striking in that it doesn't sound at all like what you think of the neocons as sounding like. It talks about having to learn to live with other societies, and I am pulling it up on my computer, and I'll read it quickly to start the conversation. Here we go. Non-Western civilization will continue to attempt to acquire the wealth, technology, skills, machines, and weapons that are part of being modern. They will also attempt to reconcile this modernity with their traditional culture and values. The same thing that lots of Americans try to do, in fact. Their economic and military strength relative to the West will increase. Remember, this is being written in 94. Hence,
there's a lot of prescient stuff in that essay.
Yeah, a lot of not so prescient stuff too. But
there's It's a we're
okay, so hang on. Hence, the West will increasingly have to accommodate these non-Western modern civilizations whose power approaches that of the West, but whose values and interests differ significantly from those of the West. This will require the West to maintain the economic and military power necessary to protect its interests in relation to these civilizations. That's kind of a classic realist statement up to that point. It will also, however, require the West to develop a more profound understanding of the basic religious and philosophical assumptions underlying other civilizations and the ways in which people in those civilizations see their interests. It will require an effort to identify elements of commonality between Western and other civilizations. For the relevant future, there will be no universal civilization, but instead a world of different civilizations, each of which will have to learn to coexist with the others. Which is a very different Huntington from what you sort of think of if you read the first few paragraphs of Clash of Civilizations, or if you're mostly acquainted with how it was used.
Well, right. I mean, this is, yes. Huntington is a careful, nuanced thinker who actually has in that plenty of caveats that would address some of the criticisms that come later. Like he says, I think nation states will continue to be relevant. I mean, there were people who took Clash of Civilizations to an extreme that Huntington was not comfortable with. But fundamentally, I find myself disagreeing with some of it as it relates now, some 14 years later, in that I worry that on the right with people like Robert Spencer and on the left with some of the anti-war movement that we saw in Iraq, that there is a tendency to view the extreme Islamic supremacists, people like Hamas or people like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to be the tribunes of true Islam, or to be the tribunes of like speaking in the most authentic voice, speaking for these people. And I've never bought that.
Yeah.
And I think that Huntington gets into that trap a little bit. Ironically, there's a really interesting thing in there, which is that in light of the 2003 war in Iraq and he talks about the first Gulf War and says and points out that in fact this is an example of an early clash between Islam and the West, and saying that pointing out that Saddam Hussein is making all these appeals to the Ummah, and which is interesting in light of the kind of subsequent debate about pre-war intelligence and whether Saddam had any possible connection or could possibly at one point collaborate with Islamic supremacists or jihadist groups. But what's interesting about it is that how much of the civilizational stuff and the Clash of Civilizations thesis is used by various groups as a pretext and is not really the driving factor.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think Milosevic is representing, sort of a resurgence of Greek Orthodox Christianity? Or is he just a fascist who is using ancient sort of hatreds and ancient and a kind of a chauvinistic history in order to mobilize his population for a war of conquest?
And it's interesting because Huntington kind of walks up to this and never quite says it. And ultimately, the way I actually the argument he makes that I would agree with is that in the same way that ideology was used as a motivating tool around very traditional sort of economic and socio-military power interests, alleged civilizational values are now being used for that purpose, in the way that nationalism was used at the end of the 19th century and ideology was used in the middle of the 20th century, and now these sort of alleged civilizational values are being taken up by people like Milosevic, by people like Bin Laden.
Hamas.
And Hamas and whoever else, but again, in the same way, it's a cover, it's a motivator, it's a rabble rousing, if you forgive me for using that phrase. And what I get very frustrated in, and it wasn't just Huntington. I mean, the stuff that Robert Kaplan was writing at that time in the mid '90s, as if the sort of ancient ethnic hatreds thing, as if somehow. All by themselves, that was what made the world go round. And it isn't what makes, I hate to be I will be kind of materialist about this, because it's economics and power that make the world go round, and we like to think of ourselves as better creatures than that, and therefore we use these other motivational tools. I hate to be kind of old-line Marxist about it, but there you are. So that's where I think that Huntington, and he may himself have understood this, but it's not put clearly enough. And the one in the Clash of Civilizations article that drove me crazy, and maybe it's because I was just in India before the holidays, but this notion that somehow there's an ancient civilizational divide between India and Pakistan. And whereas, if you go back and you think about Bengal, and you think about Kashmir, and you think about Punjab, and you say, well, wait, these were actually places that were societies that were very well knit together in some kind of fascinating ways, and they were ripped apart in the last 100 years. They were not sort of carefully divorced along a clear previously existing fault line. They were ripped apart in some very unusual ways. And if you look now at the Indian state and the Pakistani state, you would kind of have to conclude that the non-Huntington worldview state, India, is doing a lot better than the Huntington worldview state, Pakistan, despite, the continuing pressures on the Indian state from Hindu nationalism on the one hand and radical Islam on the other. I mean, the Indian state is actually thriving by most measures. So you look at that and you say, okay, well, fine, here's sort of a test of the Huntington worldview, and yes, it's very scary to be India in its neighborhood, and yes, you have naysayers all the time, and yes, you have communal violence, which is significant and shouldn't be wished away, but the Indian state is an extraordinary testament to what you can do against sort of Huntingtonian values or appeals.
Right. Well, another way of putting it, there may be a clash of civilizations, but it seems that only one civilization or one group of people claiming to speak for a civilization is fighting it. The left, not the left, the West.
Where's he going with that?
Right. The West, or modern democracies, have a wonderful ability to absorb different strains of cultures and civilization and keep them under one tent so they don't fight each other. It is the problem when we have unfree states. See, you look at the world in terms of the sort of Marxian viewpoint. I look at it as a sort of struggle between freedom and tyranny. But in unfree states like Pakistan, or corrupted, failing states like Pakistan, where you have a resurgence of the jihadist sentiment, those are the people pushing the issue. I mean, Channel 4 in London broadcast, of all people, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in the kind of rebuttal to the Queen's Christmas message. So, you know what I'm saying? The West does not seek civilizational conflict. And I don't think that the West pushing for transparency, elections, rule of law, and these kinds of things should be seen from the viewpoint, as Huntington would see them, as sort of imposing our civilization on people who just have no interest in it. I think that those sorts of things will lead to kind of common prosperity. And I think that also we're going to see in the next year in Iraq a number of Iraqis embracing Western notions like, elections. It's not going to be a perfect fit, but whereas you're going to see the forces of jihadism that claim to speak for this civilization have and will continue to oppose them. So I don't know if it's as clear as Huntington sort of would say it is. All of that said, there is something to what he's saying, though, which is that the movements that we're worried about right now, and he did predict that last paragraph that you read, I think is really interesting. Because do you remember a book by Ben Barber called Jihad versus McWorld?
I do.
So in Jihad versus McWorld, Ben Barber just sort of says, hey, there's some cultures, and Friedman says this in the Lotus and the Olive Tree too, there's some cultures that have access to the internet, and people who have access to the internet are going to become modern because that's what you need to do in order to have this stuff, and that's just not true. We've seen jihadists make great use of the web. You know what I'm saying?
Eli,
we've seen
there's two things.
He got that.
One is
right.
Howard, I think this is Huntington's whole point, which is that one can become modern without becoming Western.
Exactly. And he's right about that.
This is, to say that the jihadis aren't modern is kind of a misunderstanding of right. modernity. The jihadis mm-hmm. are modern. The jihadis are right. spawned by modernism just as surely as the fact that you and I are doing this blogging heads with our goofy little camera technology is right. spawned by modernism. They're two faces of a right. secular technological phenomenon.
Right.
But I wanted to back up. Just let's see if I can recap. You said one thing a couple minutes ago that I disagreed with vehemently, and now I'm trying to go back in my mind and reassemble my counterattack. Oh, that's what it was. If you were sitting in a university in Islamabad or Kabul or Tehran or Jakarta or Bandung or wherever, and you wanted to assemble the evidence that there were at least some folks in the West, and they would be folks in pretty senior positions who did view the world in civilizational conflict terms. It would have a pathetically easy time assembling things like, if you're not with us, you're against us, Islam is this, Islam is that. You would use the kinds of examples you cited earlier of people making radical Islamic spokespeople representative of all of Islam. You would cite the cases of senior military commanders saying, we have to convert all these people, calling them heathens, saying they were going to hell, saying, they hate us for our freedoms, and so on and so forth. And you could look at all of that, and I must say, you could be forgiven for concluding that there were some pretty powerful people in the West who do view this in civilizational conflict terms. I'll just...
Well, I wouldn't forgive them for that, because, in fact, we've seen one of the successes of Bush is that he understood very early on that, he made that one comment that got a lot of play about, he used the word crusade, unfortunately, but for the most part, Bush has invested a tremendous amount of rhetorical energy, and the State Department has put millions and millions of dollars into the idea that there is a conflict within Islam, that there are plenty of moderate Muslims. And when I was in Cairo, you could go to the Al-Azhar Mosque and you could find plenty of Islamic scholars who knew the Quran up and down, and that it was the U.S. policy to try to bolster these people. And that we saw that, I think, the greatest success is that could someone say that the Sheikhs of Anbar are less Arab or less Muslim than Al-Qaeda in Iraq? I'd say the Bush administration has gone out of its way to understand the conflict in non-Huntingtonian terms and to distinguish between the extreme and violent fringes of Islam, as they say it may be more popular, and then the sort of bulk of what they say is the sort of moderate majority of Muslims.
So, Eli, I would say that the Bush administration fought a civil war with itself over exactly this point, and that the problem was that for every kind of person toiling away in the State Department trying to get that point across, every time you had some high-ranking general go on TV and say, we've got to convert them,
there was one guy who did that, and he was severely reprimanded.
Yeah, but he was only reprimanded, and that I would say that cancels out the free coverage that got, and this isn't fair, but it is the way the world works now, that the free coverage that got all over the world probably canceled out hundreds of millions of dollars of public diplomacy spending designed to convince people of the opposite. And this, by the way, is what's ultimately, I think, so dangerous about the Huntington, about the Clash of Civilizations thesis, is that it's so seductive. Because as I said on Dan Dresner's blog, the beauty of it is it justifies all kinds of bad behavior on the part of anybody in any of the civilizations without requiring any kind of self-assessment. It says, see, they do hate us for our freedoms. It's inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. So we don't have to try. We can just say, well, they hate us because of who we are, and we like who we are. So it's very self-reinforcing for everyone. And that means, I think, when you see something negative, whether it's an American saying something inappropriate like that, or whether it's an extremist Islamic cleric saying something inappropriate, that kind of reinforces this very easy paradigm. And it takes much more effort to break down that paradigm. And so, the Bush administration was fighting with itself, and I think it did worse than fight itself to a draw, ultimately, even though... I
don't know. I think you're being Niborian in the extreme, Heather.
I'm being what?
Because I understand. I've been recently, because, Huntington was a huge fan of Niebuhr, and Niebuhr is, I think, the key insight, as Peter Beiner put in his book, and that you get from the liberal internationalist side. Our first dialogue, you said, what's the key difference between a Democrat and a neoconservative? Modesty. But it's also this sort of notion that we too can sin in the West. And I, of course I accept that in the abstract and so forth. But there's a huge difference between having a president that is specifically pushing back on the natural inclination after 9/11 to assume that all of the Muslims are at war with us, and to have, a very deliberate strategy of seeking out moderate voices in Islam, and then the leadership of, say, the Islamic Republic of Iran or the jihadist organizations, which are indeed seeking the kind of civilizational, or what they see as a civilizational conflict that Huntington believes is sort of the accurate description of things to come.
Okay, so
and I just don't see that as an.
Let's only talk about the American case then, because you can look at the global public opinion data, and you can notice that pretty big pluralities of people in Muslim societies think that the United States does not have their best interests at heart. And then you can ask yourself, okay, why is that? And then you can sort of reluctantly conclude that although a lot of effort was put into reaching out to those folks and saying, hey, this isn't a war on you, we can conclude that it didn't work. And then we can ask ourselves why it didn't work. And I'm offering a hypothesis for why it didn't work, which is that there were enough countervailing signals coming from Washington that could lead a person to have doubts. And I think, I'll make if I know somebody, and 9 times out of 10, when he talks to me, he's great and totally pleasant. And then the 10th time he lets something really crude about women slip, I form an opinion about him, even if the other 9 times are totally fine, or the other 99 times are totally fine, frankly. I form an opinion, and then it's very hard for me to shake that opinion afterwards. And I think I'm not drawing any moral equivalences between anybody. Right. I'm just saying that when you are primed to be suspicious and you hear something that reinforces your suspicions, it takes a lot of effort to wipe that out of anybody's psyche anywhere in the world afterwards. And that is one way, Pache, Huntington, I do believe that we are all alike.
All right, well, on the public diplomacy point, I guess it depends on what country, and sometimes, by the way, these polls that are taken in countries like Syria, where everybody assumes their phones are tapped, are not always the best indicator as a poll, say, taken, in a country like England or something like that. But that said, I think that the Iraq experience shows that there are a number of Muslims, there are a number of Arabs that are willing to fight against the forces that seek the civilizational conflict, or in the case of Iraq, sought a competitive genocide.
Yep.
And that those people should be our allies. Mm-hmm. And my hope for Obama would be that he can figure out, back to the Gaza question, back to all these questions, is that he can figure out a clever and more effective way than Bush did of aligning the U.S., the mighty power of the U.S. and the West with its economic resources, its cultural resources, its political resources, and even its military resources, with what I really have to think is at least a plurality, if not a majority, within the Islamic world that will ultimately beat back, those forces that seek this kind of civilizational conflict.
To which, Eli, I say, Inshallah, Amen, and Kain Tahiyya Lanu. And so, on that note, since we're unlikely to reach any higher point of agreement than that, shall we?
Well, but I'm saying that I think that there's a huge difference between that and then, what has been a kind of diplomatic consensus that's emerging, even, by the way, that I would pinpoint with Condoleezza Rice, which is that, let's come up with an accommodation with, in some cases, like Hamas, though that's something that Obama says he won't do, and that's something that the Bush administration won't do, but clearly Iran, that with those forces that are sort of seeking that, can we moderate them? And that we've disagreed on that. I can understand, by the way, the argument for short-term tactical reasons to try to come to some sort of agreement on things, but I think if you really want to solve the problem, ultimately you've got to figure out a way to marry American might and Western might with those Iranians who I think do seek a kind of modernity, not just in technology but also in values. And that's where I am going to dissent from Huntington, though I have tremendous respect for the guy, and it's amazing how many people he's responsible for. He was the teacher of Fareed Zakaria. I know that he's had an influence on people around David Petraeus. Huntington is a giant intellectual figure. Yes. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But on that point, I think I would dissent from Huntington.
All right. So in the new year, let us make a date to come back here and debate over what the definition of a moderate is, because I think that's where you and I part company.
Well, that's good. Okay. So, do you want to do the very end predictions?
Sure. I suspect you have more elaborate ones than I do, so I'll
No, I haven't really thought it. I actually kind of. Do you have? What are your predictions?
Let's see. I had come up with 2, and now I have forgotten one. You know what? I don't have predictions. I said I would have predictions. I don't have predictions. And so I just want to sort of wish everyone Happy New Year and try to come back on predictions in the future. How's that?
I have a prediction.
Okay, go for it.
There will be Iraqi provincial elections.
Okay.
There will be national elections, if we're lucky, at the end of 2009, but more likely early 2010. And the new government after those elections will seek to renegotiate the Status of Forces Agreement, and thus sort of cementing a much smaller long-term sort of training presence of U.S. troops in Iraq, and ultimately Obama will go along with it.
I think you might be right about that, and then I will offer one in return, which is that Hillary Clinton will turn out to be a very good Secretary of State, chiefly because she will actually turn attention to helping repair and strengthen the State Department from inside, as evidenced by the Jack Lew appointment. And you will see evidence of this because there will be angst in the building about internal changes being made, but there will actually be attention paid to the internal structure and state of affairs, which will be a welcome change, as it has happened very rarely. So
really?
Success will be marked by a certain amount.
You don't think that she'll be like this, super celebrity on the 7th floor who will use her own kind of State Department kitchen cabinet at the exclusion of the regional bureaus and the undersecretary, and that they will kind of have the same complaints that they did under Albright?
I actually think some of both of those things will be true. That on the one hand, she will come in with a kitchen cabinet, and that will make people very unhappy. On the other hand, she will come in and actually want to understand how the org chart works and what connects to what and how it could be changed and made to function better, and have a real concern for the functioning of the bureaucracy and the structure and the details, because that's the kind of mind she has. And, as I say, because she's appointing Jack Lew, who that's all he does, and he's got a great mind for it, and he is tough and tenacious, to be a deputy who actually cares about these things, and that the building will not be able to slough off and go about its business. So, as I say, there will be change in the department, but it will be upheavaling in a way, so that, as I say, the way you'll know something important is going on is that they'll be whining, and it will go beyond just the kitchen cabinet to, oh my gosh, she's trying to change things. And I'm a booster of the State Department. I spent a lot of years working there. I have huge respect for the career folks, but it's been allowed to atrophy, and the training's not good enough, and the mix of recruitment's not good enough, and the structure of how appointments are done is not good enough. And the way that when that changes, there'll be a lot of resistance, because that's kind of the nature of bureaucratic politics. But she's someone who understands and cares about bureaucratic politics, so I predict that it will be a sort of Chinese curse interesting times kind of year at the State Department.
But don't you think though that it looks like she's going to have special envoy for this, special envoy for that, and there's going to be some confusion as to the special envoy for Middle East engagement. Well, what about the assistant secretary for Near East Affairs? And you know what I'm saying? I could foresee it. I know that Colin Powell, when he came in, just told the building, hey, I'm your advocate. I want you to give me all your ideas. I want you to do all this stuff. And then the other interesting thing is that under the Bush years, USAID has been effectively folded into the State Department. So it's already has, in some ways, more bureaucratic power than it did before Bush, ironically.
Well, let me stop you, though, because actually what's happened is the parts of USAID that are getting the most money have actually been pulled out and are run as separate operations. The Millennium Challenge and PEPFAR, the AIDS programs, so that the frustrating thing about the Bush years has been that USAID was further folded in, but the most sort of interesting parts of it were taken away. So there's a huge...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
There's a huge challenge.
But Millennium Challenge is still done by state, right?
It has its own coordinator. And it's very frustrating. I mean, it's a classic example of trying to save little bits it's the opposite of what I was talking about. It's kind of, you're not actually interested in making the institution run. You're just interested in having a sexy little program. So, and again, there's a huge debate actually within the aid community about what the best way to fix. Do you fix it within state? Do you build a whole new AIDS ministry, as it were? Do you take AID back out of state? There's, by the way, a parallel debate about public diplomacy, which which one could also get into. And these are going to be hard issues, and people are going to be made unhappy about them. But just the fact that we're actually discussing structural problems it's going to be so refreshing. And back to your other point, there's been a lot of gossip in the press about layers upon layers of envoys, but none of them have actually been appointed. And it's also...
I'm responsible for some of that.
Yes, you are. And
having written about the Iran envoy.
Right, but the other thing
job,
which I
was told after the piece, by the way, may have been jumping the gun.
Yeah.
That is an idea that is percolating.
Right, well, I think, A, you and others have jumped the gun, and B, the interest in envoys... I think this is one where it's not necessarily the right thing to say, oh, Senator Clinton is going to do so-and-so. It seems to me that interest is coming from, the Obama folks and the team as a whole. So if there are layers upon layers of envoys reporting to different people, I think it's important to see that as coming from the number one guy, for better, or for worse.
You think that envoys should be directly run by the White House and not necessarily the Secretary?
No, I don't think they should. Well, in general, I think diplomacy should be done by the State Department, and as much of it as possible should be done by the structures that are in place, so that if you work your way up and you actually have a bunch of background and years of experience, that should be rewarded and drawn upon. There are times where, and especially when you have a president coming in with as much personal charisma as this one does, I think it's worth working out other channels of reporting that allow somebody to go out and have the maximum oomph that says, I report directly to President Obama, and I understand why you want to leverage that at a moment where, frankly, the U.S. doesn't have as many other things to leverage as maybe we used to. So I have a lot of sympathy for why you would want to do that. It's hard to do right, and as I say, having worked for years in the State Department and with career folks and having huge respect for them, I want to see their skills and expertise get tapped better than it has been tapped. And I want to see a decline that accelerated but didn't begin in the Bush years. I want to see that reversed.
Well, but the mother of all envoys, Dennis Ross, is the Middle East envoy guy, right? Combines, in a very rare case, the skill and attention to detail of a career Foreign Service officer, and so somebody who really understands the details of the process, and a high enough profile position where, when he's talking to Arafat, he's speaking for President Clinton and Madeleine Albright. So you kind of want the best of both worlds, right? You want somebody who knows the shot, knows the detail, knows the history, but you also want somebody who has the political oomph in the new administration. Well,
the only people who are getting a lot less holiday vacation than I'm getting are agonizing over these questions as we speak, and it'll be fun to see. It'll be fun to see what actually happens, and we'll talk again when it does.
All right.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.